Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and welcome to this video in this Intro to React 2021 course. In this video we're going to focus on iterating over data. So basically the focus here is going to be a map looping over data to create JSX, and just kind of understanding like how that works in JSX, how that works in React. Okay, so again I'm going to clear out the app component. So I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to create a component called iterate.js. Okay, iterate.js. I'll just copy the stuff from header, and I will just create this component. Iterate, make this a div. Good. Now this is imported to my app.js. Iterate, and then I'm going to use the iterate component here, so that way that shows up while we are doing this exercise. npm start. Okay, so that's going to start up the server, which opened it up over here. So bring that up over here. There we go. Delete the old one, and we see iterate. So what I'm going to want to do, is head over to my iterate component, and basically the idea here is like, how would I make an array, several different things appear at the same time. One way I could do it is I could just make an array. So I could just sit there and say const, let's say dogs. Okay, const dogs equals, and then for each dog I'm going to give it an h1 that says, you know, an h1 that says Sparky. Then the next thing in the array is another h1 that says Spot, and then another h1 that says Rover. Okay, so this is really an array of JSX. See, it's an array of h1s, and then I could just inject that array simply by just saying dogs. And let me just put the other curly bracket. I can inject arrays of JSX, and that will be fine. But what if I don't know exactly how many dogs they're going to be? Because I have, so for example, let's pretend instead of having an array of JSX, so let me just get rid of the dogs here for a second. I have an array of names. So I have an array of Sparky, Spot, and Rover. I mean, that now the question is, how can I turn that into the same thing? I could theoretically do this. I could just sit there and say like const dog JSX, and then I can say this equals an empty array, and then do something like this. I could do a for dog of dogs, use a normal for of loop, and then for each loop just sit there and say, okay, dog.jsx or dog JSX dot push an h1 with that particular dog. Like, this would technically work, because again, for each loop this is going to represent the singular dog that's inside of dogs. Okay, so it wants me to do like let dog of dogs. So I declare a variable called dogs that'll hold the individual dog. Okay, and then that'll push into the dog JSX. So let me just refresh. And then what I can do is then inject the dog JSX here. Like, that's fine. That'll work. So see, that works, but this is typically not the way you'll do it. I mean, you can just use traditional JavaScript, imperative JavaScript to do it, but there's another way. There's an array method called map. Map creates an array from another array, and that's typically the way you'll see people in React create that array of JSX for each item in an array. So instead of saying a for loop, what they would generally do is do this instead. So let me get rid of, I'll comment that out, and then I'll get rid of this thing here. What they would do is they would take the dogs array and then use the map method, which is that's not a React thing. That's a built-in JavaScript array method. I have several videos on this one method alone because it's such a key method. But all it does, it takes a function, and then it creates an array of the return value of that function. So in that case, this function takes the individual items as an argument. So in this case, I'm going to take each individual dog. As a second argument, it takes the index of that item. So now what I can do is I can say for each dog, I want to return H1 and then put in the name of the dog there. Cool. And see, that does the trick. That loops over the dog. Okay, and that works pretty well. Okay, so that works pretty well. Nice. That works. Okay, because essentially what's happening is that for each dog, so for each string in this array, it's returning an H1, and that's going to get returned in this new array. Okay, so, but the thing that people always make a mistake of is they forget, because they have this return here, they forget to put the return inside the map. Because this function needs to return a value, but your function for the component needs to return a value. So always make sure you have all the necessary return statements, so that way, because what happens if I take this out, then nothing gets returned, so the array is empty and I still have nothing. So like, wait a second, I wrote the JSX in there, but it's because you forgot the return inside the maps callback. Okay, now notice if I open this up, I should get a warning. See if I see that warning anywhere. Well, typically I would get a warning. Yep, there it is. Each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So when you pass in an array of JSX, what it wants is that each item in the array should have a key prop. That's how React can tell, like, on subsequent renders, is it rendering the same item from the array? Even if they, like, their order changes and whatnot, if there's some sort of unique way to tell, and typically you're dealing with like data from a database, so like the item from the database has like a unique ID, and that's what you should use as the key. In this case, I'm using an array of data, so there really isn't a unique key. One thing I could do is I could pass the string itself, so key equals dog. So that way, in that case, if it's the dog with the same name, it doesn't have to like re-render it, it'll just leave it there and add the ones that are new. And this allows React under the hood to optimize how it re-renders the screen. Because it can be like, okay, was this thing already rendered before? Let me just leave it there and render the ones that are new. But if you don't put a key prop, then it renders all of them every time, and it's just not as optimized, which is fine for small applications, but becomes a bottleneck for larger and larger applications where you're rendering huge lists of maybe thousands of items. Okay, imagine like, you know, a dashboard where a customer is looking at all their products, and you're rendering like 10, 20, 30, 40 products at a time. Okay, so that is what's going on there. And that's generally how you iterate. Okay, you just use map. But sometimes people get confused with this whole word map, because map doesn't necessarily, in your mind, for most people, like translate. What you're really doing is you're mapping one value to another value. That's why it's called map, because you're mapping this to this. You're saying this, for each one of these things, pass it through the map, the function that map has, and I'm mapping the old value to a new value. But again, that's not terminology that most people just sort of like off the top of their heads feel comfortable with. What I have done to kind of make this easier is if you go to npmjs.com, I've created a library of my own custom hooks and components called Merced React Components, or actually Merced React Hooks, which you can install and use. That makes certain things easier. Okay, so again, Merced React Hooks. So let's install it real quick. So npm install Merced React Hooks. And if I install that, there's like a couple components that make certain things a lot easier. Okay. So okay, I'm just waiting for that to install. Okay, it's finished installing. So now I can use this, and I have this loop component that's in there. Okay, so that's starting. So now what I could do instead, like if I didn't want to use map manually, I've created a component that does all that for you. So basically what we would do is we would import loop. Nope, doesn't recognize it yet. Import loop from Merced React Hooks. Okay, and then we would just use it in this fashion. So what would happen is that instead of me using this map statement, so instead of me using map, I would just use this loop component. So I would say loop, and I would say with this, meaning what's the array you're looping over. So in that case, that would be dogs. I'm looping over that array. I'm going to say loop with this, and then I'm going to have a do that prop. That means with this, do that, meaning with this array, return this JSX for each item in that array. And then what you do is you pass the do that prop the function, which is the same thing. So it'd be like, you know, dog index. It would be literally the same thing. H1 dog. Okay, but this might be semantically easier to appreciate. And then again, I would close the loop. Okay, and then that's how that would work. Let me just make this a little bit easier to read. Oh, there's my bird off in the distance looking for attention. I'll give it attention in a moment. Oh, Wally. Okay, but yeah, so there you go. See, I'm just passing those props. It's the same thing as using map. I'm specifying the array and the function that it's going to map over, but again, semantically might be easier to use. But I should end up with the same result. See, Sparky spot rover. Okay, another thing that, you know, people do, since we're on this topic, is conditionally rendering things. Okay, saying this thing should show up if this is true. And usually what you would do is, I would do something like this. I would create two variables. So, you know, if true, I want to render h1 true. So I save this in a variable. And then I'll say const if false equals h1 false. Okay. And then what you would do is I would use curly brackets to escape. Again, that's how I escape, and I can do JavaScript expressions. And I would use what's called a ternary operator. Okay, to conditionally render it, saying, okay, if true, so we'll say if true is true, which is always going to be true, then what I want to render is if true, and if that is false, then render if false. Okay, and you'll see this is going to render true because true is always true. But if I change this to false, then it's going to render false. So in this case, it'll render different things depending on whether something is true or false. So this would just be typically how you would create like conditional logic. Or what you could do is you could do an if and then assign a different thing to a variable and then inject the variable. You could do that, and again, that doesn't require you to install any library. But if you end up using Merced React hooks for the loop component, there's also this condition component. Okay, so if I were to bring that component in, condition, I could have done this instead. I could just say condition if, and then here I put what should be true or false. So I'm going to say if true, or you can say like if 1 is greater than 3, which it's not, so that's going to be false. That's the expression though. Okay, then what we'll do is we will, and then again I will close the component, and then when you put what will happen inside the condition component. So I'm going to say, inject if true. That's what's going to happen if it's true. And then if it's not true, then I can specify something else as a prop. So I'll just do, then, if it's not true, then it'll render if false. Okay. So again, the way the condition component works is I use the condition component. Inside shows what inside as a child is what would happen if it's true, and then I have an if not prop if I want something to show up if it's false. If I don't want anything to show up if it's false, then I can just ignore that prop and it'll just be nothing if it's false. So right now, let me refresh. Okay, not quite rendering what I want. Maybe I just wrote this wrong. Oh yeah, because it's not camel case. If not is all lowercase, so if not, and there you go. So you see false shows up there, but if I make this a true statement, 1 is less than 3. 1 is less than 3. Fragment is not defined. Okay. That's interesting. What if... That's interesting. Saying fragment's not defined, which it should be. So that's something I'll probably have to go fix up in the library, but it'll be fixed up by the time you watch this video. Okay. I'll just remove the fragment. Easy peasy. Okay. So, in that case, but that would otherwise work. So that's another thing you can use. There's a lot of other cool hooks and tools you can use here. Okay. In Merced React hooks. Again, I'll fix that one little thing. So I'll push up a new version literally right after this video. So it'll be fixed before this video is even public on YouTube. But that's another tool in case you don't want to use map. You don't want to use just like ternary operators. But that's how you would do it in normal React. You would use ternary operators. You would use the map method to loop over arrays, etc. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a little clarity on like how would I loop over data to create the HTML if I have an array of data, and how could I conditionally show data in my JSX. Again, you can use if statements, you can use for loops if you really want, but typically what you're going to see in React code is using the map method for looping in arrays, and then using ternary operators within your JSX to do sort of conditional rendering. But my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Let me push this code up. So that is going to be pushy map and if origin map. Awesome. I guess next we'll talk about the use effect hook and API calls. So we'll just do git checkout -b use effect for the next video. Okay, and I'll see you then.